Well, hello. Welcome to our event, Defiant, what the women of Exodus teach us about freedom. My name is Daniel Johnson, and I'm a program curator here at Upper House, a Christian study center near the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where we welcome all who long to explore the life of the mind and the questions of the soul. We are thrilled to host author, speaker, and practical theologian Kelley Nikondeha for today's talk. In her talk, Kelley will explore the deep work women do to create conditions for liberation in their church, community, and country today. She will show us how to partner with God in the work of liberation worldwide, and she'll help us navigate what we might learn from the women of the Old Testament as we seek to stand in the gap of the oppressed. So here's a little bit about Kelley. Kelley is the co-director and chief storyteller for Communities of Hope, a community development enterprise in Burundi. She's also the author of Adopted, the Sacrament of Belonging in a Fractured World, a Christianity Today 2018 award winner, and recently published Defiant, what the women of Exodus teach us about freedom. Kelley also serves as the theologian in residence for She Loves magazine. Let's welcome Kelley.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome. So glad you are here. Thank you so much for being with us today, this morning, and we're so grateful for these last 2 days, and it's been really fun to have you here virtually with us from Arizona, which is really fun. So, hey, I just wanted to highlight one thing before we jump over to you, Kelley, for this morning's talk. So our friends at Ehrman's, where Kelley has both of her books, have generously given us a discount for both of her books. So if you go on over to urbans.com and you use the promo code UHouse40, that'll give you 40% off of either of her books or both of them if you want to buy them together, which I'm sure you would want to do. So we would love to direct you there. It's just applies to Kelley's books, not other books at Ehrman's, but just her books. So wanted to highlight those here on the top of our conversation this morning. So, well, Kelley, welcome again, and we are so grateful for you to be here. And I'm just going to hand the reins over to you for the talk this morning. We will come back together after the talk and do some Q&A. So in the Q&A function here on Zoom, if you would just put any questions you have in there, and then I can relay those to Kelley for the kind of the final part of our talk this morning. So welcome, and we're excited to hear from you this morning.
Thank you. Well, it's been wonderful to be with the Upper House this week. Today, I basically want to do some storytelling. So sit back, relax. This is a grown up story hour. So, two women are standing in front of Pharaoh. Now, these are not just any midwives. Shifra and Pua are the leaders of the midwifery guild in the Hebrew community in Egypt. They are the ones who serve these Hebrews who we're told are so fruitful. They are multiplying at such a fast rate. They are coming. They're prolific. This community is just bursting at the seams, and it's this community that is just growing in numbers and growing in a certain kind of greatness that really threatened the Pharaoh of their day, and really pharaohs haven't changed much, have they, when it comes to their fixation with numbers and greatness. And so Pharaoh calls these women to meet with him. And he looks at them and he says, when the Hebrew women are at the birth stool, when they're about to give birth, when you can ascertain that it's a baby boy, kill him. But if it's a baby girl, you can let her live. Pharaohs always underestimate the women. So Shifra and Pua leave the court of Pharaoh and they rush to meet up with all the other midwives who are probably really eager for their return. What did Pharaoh want with us? So they tell them what Pharaoh's plan is to kill the baby boys. That's what we're supposed to do. And we're supposed to do it quietly to not raise any attention. Well, what the story tells us is that when these midwives left, they were more they feared God more than Pharaoh. The text says that they feared God. And so when they met with their fellow midwives, the decision was made. No, no, no. We are going to keep on delivering babies in accordance with the God of life. We're going to do what our mothers and their mothers before them have taught us to do, to deliver baby boys and baby girls however God sends them to us. They organized the first act of civil disobedience ever recorded in Scripture. These women defied Pharaoh. So we don't know how long this campaign lasted. We don't know how many baby boys these midwives saved from this death edict. But at some point, Pharaoh figured it out, and he summoned them a second time to come back to his court and stand before him. What have you done? Why have you done this? He raged. And the women looked at him, the midwives, and they're like, well, I mean, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They were using his prejudice against him. And they continued, the Hebrew women, they're just so strong, and their babies, they just come too fast for us to intervene. They lied. And for that, Scripture says, God rewarded the midwives with families of their own. Thank God for Shiphrah and Puah, for their subversive strength, because the Hebrew community kept growing. Scripture says that their community increased mightily because of their work. This time, Pharaoh's covert operation didn't work. This time. But I love how the storyteller, he uses a very classic Hebrew literary device, names. He tells us about Shiphrah and Puah, but he leaves Pharaoh unnamed. By doing so, he's directing our attention to the women. The names are meant to show us where to focus our attention, where the action of the story is. Shiphrah and Puah, remember their names. Remember their salvific work among you. Pharaoh, they come and go. You don't even need to commit their names to memory. So already we are being told that the women are worth paying attention to in this story. And I love Dr. Will Gaffney, who has written Womanist Midrash, says that in Shiphrah and Puah, we see the first deliverers in the story of deliverance. And I love that the first time we see deliverers in Exodus, they're women. I love it. So when Pharaoh realized that he had been outmaneuvered by a group of organized women, he knew he had to change up his strategy. And so what Exodus tells us is that Pharaoh commanded all his people, the text says. And he told them that when you see a baby boy from the Hebrew community, you can kill him. Drown him in the Nile. If it's a baby girl, if it's a daughter of a Hebrew, you can let her live. Again, totally underestimating the women. But I don't know if you noticed what just happened there. But Pharaoh just made every Egyptian complicit in his death edict. And every time I read this particular verse, it always makes me really nervous, to be honest, because I think about the ways in which I am complicit. How have I been made complicit as a citizen of my own country or empire? How have I been made complicit as a subject of this Pharaoh. I mean, it should make us all pause and wonder. Um, Now, maybe most Egyptians didn't hear the edict. Maybe, they weren't within earshot of Pharaoh when he stood behind, the Egyptian seal and made his proclamation declaring death to baby boys and deputizing every Egyptian to the task. But the text doesn't give Egyptians an exemption clause. It just says all. And I think we need to take the text seriously, um, especially in these days. Meanwhile, other side of the river, we hear that a woman has conceived and bore a child. We'll learn later in the story that her name is Jochebed, and she is the son, or she's the daughter of the house of Levi, or maybe even Levi himself. So she comes from a very good family, but she has a baby at a very bad time when you know the political landscape in Egypt, right? For 9 months, Jochebed carries this child and she doesn't know girl or boy, life or death. 9 months of not knowing. That took some kind of bravery. I imagine it also involved some amount of trauma. And so we probably shouldn't rush past what seems like just a tiny verse in the Exodus story, but all the freight in that this woman would have been both brave and traumatized during the tenure of her pregnancy. But finally, the time comes. And I assume the midwives were there with her, acting as the tender hands and the strong arms of God, bringing her baby into the world. And when this baby was out and in their arms, I am sure there were words of praise and blessings and sighs too deep for words. It was a boy. But Jochebed, the story says that when Jochebed saw her baby boy, she called him Tov. Tov is the Hebrew word for good. God created the light on the first day and called it good. God created the oceans and called them good. God created the trees and the bushes and the fruit on the trees and called it all tov, good. This is the very word she uses to describe the first glance at her baby boy. She recognized all of creation goodness in her son. It didn't matter that Pharaoh called him a thug. It didn't matter that Hebrews said he was born in the wrong zip code on the wrong side of the Nile. She knew he was as good as anything God had ever created. And the story says she hid him for 3 months. 3 months. That was all she had. It was all she had to protect him from the unjust world of Pharaoh and Pharaoh's soldiers and the mercenaries that his rhetoric and agenda unleashed. 3 months was all she had to protect her baby boy from silent Egyptians. Egyptians who remained quiet as baby boys floated down the Nile River. 3 months was all she had to sing liberation lullabies to her baby boy. And boy, did she sing! She sang of horses and chariots tossed into the sea. She sang of girls dancing and drumming underneath a golden moon. She sang of little boys running free and unafraid alongside the Nile River, trying to fill his imagination with goodness for 3 months. But during those not long enough months, she would wonder, especially when she was down by the river washing clothes. She would look at the water line of the Nile and wonder which current is going to carry away my baby boy. Which one will be his final, his end? She thought a lot about Noah's Ark during those days. He was able to circumvent floodwaters, wasn't he? If only her boy could have a similar story. But one day, when she was out doing her laundry by the river, she was looking across and she noticed another woman. And this woman seemed to be different. She was tall and poised. Maybe she was a royal. I don't know. But she was different. And somehow they caught eyes. And this woman like looked at her. She didn't look around her or through her. Jochebed was like, am I losing it? Am I imagining things? But she really could have sworn that this woman and her had a moment. Was that even possible? That somebody on the other side of the Nile was not like all the other Egyptians? That maybe this one wasn't like Pharaoh? Was that even possible? She went to bed that night wondering. The story says that when she could hide him no longer, probably because he was growing and louder and more mobile as babies do, that when she could hide him no longer, she had to do something. And Jochebed had an audacious idea. She went out and searched for a basket with the tightest weave she could find. And she got some pitch and she slathered it on to make this little raft watertight. This was like a makeshift ark. And so she gets into the Nile. She puts her little baby boy in this ark. She hikes up her skirt and she carries him across the Nile River. Undaunted by crocodiles and snakes and Leviathan that is known to haunt the waters, like most mothers I know, she would do anything to secure the safety of her son. She gets to the other side and she places this raft in a thicket of reeds so that it won't go downstream. And she puts it in the thicket of reeds right where this woman could possibly find him. This is what it had come to. The injustice of Egypt that was breathing down her neck, that meant to kill her son. That injustice pushed her to have to make a terrible, hard choice. But in that moment, the most loving thing she could consider was him surviving, even if it wasn't with her. She was betting everything on the humanity of that one woman. Man, Jochebed was in the resistance movement now, wasn't she? Right up there with the midwives, trying to save baby boys from Pharaoh's death edict. But the odds weren't in the favor of the mothers and the midwives. I mean, Pharaoh and his policies loomed as large as the pyramids. What chance did they really have? And of course, this is what pharaohs want us to believe, that we really don't stand a chance because they hold all the mechanisms of the government in their hand. We better just give up. And yet, these women continued birthing, delivering, hiding, and saving babies. They continued going back and forth across the river, enacting small salvations. These women were undaunted. It's pretty amazing, right? So, this woman comes down, probably for a bath, a little dip into the pool, into the Nile River, as it were. And she sees something in the reed. She sees it waving. There's something over there. And she tells her servant, go and get that for me and bring it here. And so the handmaid goes and she brings the basket. And the woman, I mean, she doesn't even need to see it. She can already hear that there's a baby crying in this basket. But the story says that she opened it and she looked. And there was this baby boy crying. This one was alive. Now, I don't think this was the first time that the royal daughter saw a baby boy from the other side. See, if we're to understand the story, she often bathed down by the edge of the river. I imagine that she loved to take walks along the Nile, maybe right about sunset, that time of day when the sky turns burnt orange with threads of pink. And I imagine that one day, as she was walking, maybe barefoot in the sand, that a baby washed up in front of her. A little boy, bloated and silent with death. And that little boy almost touched her feet. And there he was. And the royal, her staff tried to run and grab the little boy and kind of erase the evidence because royal women were not meant to see the underside of the empire. It was better that they just believed it was fake news. But she knew what she saw. This little boy, there he was, dead at her feet. This was no hoax. This was real. And she started weeping at what her father was doing. This wasn't a rumor anymore. I imagine that day she felt quite powerless. Matter of fact, I don't even really have to imagine it because I remember a similar day. I remember the day that I saw the picture, maybe you do too, of a little boy in a red t-shirt and blue shorts, washed up onto a beach in Turkey. His family was trying to escape an unsafe life. They were refugees, but this little boy didn't make it. And I remember seeing him and feeling, yeah, I'm privileged, but I am paralyzed to do anything about that little boy, about the massive refugee crisis in our world. And I imagine that is how the royal daughter felt. Sure, I'm Pharaoh's daughter, but I'm not even his favorite one. And while I may have some measure of ease in my life, I can't change royal policy. And so I imagine that this woman felt, yes, I am a privileged person, but I am paralyzed to do anything. I am powerless. But this one baby that she was now holding in her hands was alive. He was crying. She could do something about this one. And right about that time, the story says that a young girl came up to her and said, would you like me to help you get a nursemaid for your baby? See, this was the daughter of Jochebed and Amram. And she had been watching what was happening to her baby brother. And she had this idea that if she could get these two women together, her mom, Jochebed, and Pharaoh's daughter, that maybe they could form an alliance of some sort and save her baby brother. And it worked. The royal woman told her, go get him, a nursemaid for me. And we all knew, or we should, where there would have been plenty of milk, right? Women who had lost their babies and still carried milk. They were on the other side of the river. Let the daughters live. That's what Pharaoh said. Little did he know the capacity of daughters. The daughter of Levi, the daughter of Jochebed and Amram, his own daughter, that they would be able to subvert his authority. He had no idea. He had no imagination for that. And yet, even in the face of patriarchy, these women acted. It didn't matter if they were in the shadows of the brickyards or if they were in the courts of Pharaoh. These daughters stepped forward and enacted liberation. It's quite amazing. Never underestimate the women. Never. Now, I imagine at some point, the royal daughter must have made her way to the other side of the river, wanting to visit this little baby boy. Probably went over while Jochebed was still breastfeeding her child, right? And I imagine that she must have met Shiphrah and Puah, the first people to defy her father. Oh my God, what a meeting that must have been. But she probably wouldn't have been there long before she would have heard the women sharing about the hardship of living in the shadow of those brickyards, hearing the stories of hurt and loss. And I imagine, that as Jochebed and the midwives and the other mothers would talk, they would get so angry. Their anger would be like a white hot kiln at the way that Pharaoh treats them and makes them live and makes them lose. And I imagine that Pharaoh's daughter, as she sat among them, bristled. Oh, but not all Egyptians are like him. We are not all like him. I can imagine her just wanting to say it and restraining herself, and instead listening to their testimony and believing what they're saying, letting their anger educate her and maybe even recalibrate her own sensibilities. Because then she would have been able to feel their legitimate anger, and she would have been able to walk in deep solidarity with them. It's quite beautiful to me how these two women, the young Miriam and Jochebed, pulled the royal daughter into the Nile network. I mean, they recruited her into the resistance movement too. They created an opportunity for her to break out of her paralysis, to learn how to leverage her privilege on behalf of those who needed her to show up. And they gave her the opportunity to be part of that. They didn't think that just because she was Egyptian that we should write her off or assume the worst. They gave her a chance to show that she might be different than her father. And so she was able to be a partner with them. Today, we might use the word ally. But think about it, here's this really unorthodox partnership between an Egyptian woman and Hebrew women, all trying to save baby boys. And I'm just going to say, in my sanctified imagination, to use another phrase from Dr. Will Gaffney, I imagine this was not the only baby that they saved. Don't you think they would have tried to save more? Don't you think that once they figured out that this might work, don't you think this is a strategy that they tried to employ more than once? I have to believe so. Anyways, we're told about Moses, and we all know why, because he's going to have a special role in the rest of the story. But let's take a moment and recognize that these women, these mothers, both the birth mother and the adopted mother of Moses, right? These mothers rescued Moses. So we have the midwives who defied Pharaoh, and now we have the mothers who rescued Moses. These are some amazing women. So I'm going to fast forward just because there's another word that I want us to consider. So um, when we look further into the Exodus story, we hear that the women, we hear first that it's women, find favor with their neighbors. So think about this. There would have been low income neighborhoods where both Hebrews and Egyptians might kind of share some of the same communities, right? And we also would have had opportunities for some of the Hebrew women who would have lived under the roof and served alongside the Egyptians or served the Egyptian women, right? There were opportunities for overlap of these communities. And we're told that they would have been neighbors to each other and that the women kind of led the way in creating neighborly relationships with other Egyptian women. And we hear about this first in Exodus 3, where we're told that God says to Moses, I'm going to give you guys favor with the Egyptians. And it's going to happen as the women embrace the Egyptian women in neighborliness. So that when the time comes, those Hebrew women are going to be able to ask for jewelry, for clothing, for money. And the Egyptian women are just going to hand it over. And that is what plundering Egypt is going to look like. So God uses this, this is the method that God says he's going to use to plunder Egypt. It's going to have to do with neighborliness and favor and the movement of goods. This isn't a movement by force. This is a movement via favor. And we actually hear this triplicate, this neighbor, favor, plunder, 3 times. We hear it in Exodus 3 when God tells Moses what he's going to do. We hear it again in Exodus 11, and then we hear it in the past tense in Exodus 12 after the last of the 10 plagues has happened. We hear that, in fact, this is the way that it worked. That the Hebrews were able to look at their Egyptian neighbors, ask for what they needed. It was given to them, and that was how they plundered Egypt. So again, the women were a very integral part of plundering Egypt. It's an interesting thing to consider that really that plundering, maybe a modern word for it would be reparation. That at some point in the relationship between neighbors, they would have shared stories. They would have built relationships. And when the time came for Hebrews to leave, even their Egyptian neighbors would have known there needs to be some recompense. And so we'll compensate you as we can. Here, take this necklace that is a family heirloom. Take my bridal trove that I've been, the dresses that are beaded and weighted with jewels. Take these things as a way of saying, I'm sorry for the pain that my country has caused you, and take it and start a new life. That really, these are small scale acts of reparation. I think sometimes we get stuck thinking, oh, reparations is the numbers are so big and daunting. But there in Egypt, we see that reparation happens the small scale between neighbors who love and care for each other. I think it's a challenging and beautiful picture to consider. But this is what I want to offer you today, is that here we see women, and they are defying Pharaoh, rescuing Moses, plundering Egypt. This is what faithfulness looks like in perilous times, according to this story in the book of Exodus. Now, this was their Egypt, and this is how they handled it. We have our own Egypt, complete with our own Pharaoh, our own babies to save, our own empires to at least restructure. And I think that we are meant to reimagine what that could look like. I think that's one of the beautiful challenges of the Exodus story. Now, I grew up in the evangelical church. That's where I was raised, learned Bible stories, and uh, did Bible studies as I grew older. And um, the picture I had gotten about women in the Bible was always one that was women were kind of decentered and domesticated. Nobody ever taught me this about the Exodus women. We just all heard about Moses and Aaron, and maybe Miriam with her tambourine. But I was given a story of women that, like I said, was decentered and domesticated. And so, no surprise when I looked into the church, actually, I saw a similar dynamic. Growing up in my church, women were often decentered and domesticated. We were not allowed to be part of an elder board. We were not allowed to preach in front of the entire church. We often didn't get to be part of the decision making about the vision of our congregations and the life of our community. We were allowed to bring the hot plate. We were allowed to rule fellowship hall, but not to be involved in some of the other ways that the church decided how they would minister in their community. And I have always loved scripture. From the very first time I sat and listened to this story in Sunday school, I have been a fan. I love scripture. But I've always felt that somehow I wasn't getting the full story when it came to women. I just always had that sense that what I was told, that it wasn't complete. And therefore it wasn't really compelling to me. The role of women in scripture and in the church, until I discovered these women in the Exodus narrative. And it was like once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I mean, these women were the mentors and the matriarchs that I had longed for all my life, right there in scripture. They showed up in their society when they were needed. And they weren't just active in their homes or in their churches. They were active out in their community at large, right? Here we see these women who became agents in a society that needed them at a critical time. They knew their social location, right? They knew where they were vis-a-vis the power structures of their day, what side of the river they were on. They displayed agency. They weren't paralyzed. They were able to act, and they had political impact. I mean, remember, by the end of the story, Pharaoh's army is at the bottom of the Red Sea. The coffers of Egypt have been emptied, and the Hebrew labor force has walked out. These women had political impact. It's amazing vision, and these women have given me, I think, a better trajectory for my theological imagination, and even how to consider political engagement. These women show us what faithfulness looks like in perilous times. They help us imagine what we could do to be faithful in our own perilous times, and to follow the leading of the Spirit, whatever the Spirit is leading us to do in our home, in our church, in our community, for the sake of freedom, so that we get to participate in defying pharaohs and their death edicts. We get to participate in rescuing the vulnerable in our communities, and we get to be part of plundering unjust systems for the sake of God's generous justice in the world, right? Lately, I've been thinking what it was like when Shiphrah and Puah died right? Certainly they would have been icons in the Hebrew community, right? The first people to defy Pharaoh, right? And I wonder, when Shiphrah died, was she like the patriarch Joseph and saying, oh, my final wish is that you would carry my bones out of here when you leave? Just like Joseph, take us out. Don't let our bones stay in this land of enslavement. Or when Pua died, did she have one final word of admonition to the midwives? Did she look at them and say, always fear God, no matter how dark it gets, no matter how deep your doubt? Always fear God, not Pharaoh. Or Miriam, Miriam by now in the story would have been older, and maybe she would have come forward with a dirge that she had composed for this very occasion, and with her hand drum, and given a word to the people. I imagine that she would have told them, we are not done until Pharaoh is dethroned. And even then, we are not done until we are free, and we will leave no neighbor behind. We want everybody to experience God's generous liberation. Sometimes it takes a matriarch to rouse a nation. So I want to encourage you to consider, what does faithfulness look like in perilous times? What does it look like to defy Pharaoh, to rescue Moses, to plunder Egypt, to follow the example of Shiphrah and Pua and Jochebed and Miriam and the daughter of Pharaoh and all the neighbors in the Nile network? May their memory be a revolution.
Wow, that was great, Kelley. Thank you so much. Uh, that story just came to life in a whole new way, I think, for myself and for others, which is great. So, just a reminder, if folks have questions, just to put them in the Q&A feature here, and we would love to get those. So the first question was just a review of there's the three elements that you described in the plunder
Sure.
area. Just wondering if you could go over again those. I think a couple people were interested in just hearing that piece maybe again.
Sure. So we hear, I'm going to go back so I can get you the exact. We hear this triplicate of neighbor, favor, and plunder, three places in the Exodus story. You'll see it in Exodus 3 when God is speaking to Moses at the burning bush, where he's prophesying what's going to happen, what plunder will look like. We hear it again in chapter 11, and then we hear it in chapter 12 when it's spoken after the last plague in the past tense, like this is how it happened. And actually, when you look at those three verses, you see a progression. At first we hear that the women are going to engage in neighborliness, and that kind of favor is going to allow them at the appropriate time to ask. That's the other word you see a lot in these, ask for the jewels and the jewels, coin, clothes. And the Egyptians will just give it to you. And you'll be able to walk out with all that booty. So we get the most full form of it in Exodus 3. And then when we see it again in Exodus 11, we see a shorter form of it. And this time it says that the men will be able to engage with their neighbors and the women with their neighbors, right? So we're expanding it a bit. And by the time we get to chapter 12, it's just all the Israelites in this big move of neighborliness with all the Egyptians are going to be able to ask and walk out with all the riches of Egypt. Now, the interesting thing, if you read the scholarship on this, some scholars are like, there is no way that plunder would have been anything other than violent. But there are some Jewish scholars, and the one that I really appreciate here is Naum Sarna, who says that most likely this was hyperbole. That when they would say the word plunder, plunder was hyperbole, because we see neighborliness and favor as a pair. So favor meaning that there was some goodness there was some goodwill there, and that these relationships allowed the money, allowed the wealth to be transferred among friends, not among foes. And so when we say plunder, we're using the language of battle, but really it might have actually been hyperbole. This was just the way that God was going to move to compensate the Hebrews for their years of slavery. So I tend to think that that looks like reparations. Um, so that's my best explanation. I do have a whole chapter on that in the book. So if you wanted to go a little deeper into at least how I see it and the footnotes, etc., it is there for you.
Awesome. So we have a question here from Doug Hunt, and he asked, can you share an example of women of faith in Burundi acting in
Mm-hmm.
some of the ways that you've just described the women in Exodus?
Mm-hmm. Oh, where do I start? We work with the Batwa. So in Burundi, there are three different tribes: the Hutu, the Tutsi, and the Batwa. And the Batwa are the smallest. There's like maybe 2% at the most. Smallest, most disenfranchised tribe. In other regions, they're called the Pygmies, right? They're small in stature. They're indigenous to Burundi. And so we work a lot with this particular tribe. And I remember we started off working with 30 families. And, we were trying to teach them that this is going to be a different kind of enterprise, that we didn't want to take care of them forever. We just wanted to give them a good head start and trust that they were going to be able to move into sustainability. Anyways, I remember once that there's two different stories. It's hard to pick, but the community was at the place where we were starting to do some livestock initiatives, and so one of the ones was pigs, and we had decided that we were going to give a pair of pigs to each of the 30 families so that they could, raise. Really, pork there is more for you raise and then you sell them at the market. It's a moneymaker. And we had a couple women who were on the leadership team, the committee that oversaw the community, and the women were the ones who kind of led with this idea of what if we all kind of agreed that the first litter. So once our pigs procreate, that the first litter we will give to our neighbors. Now, their neighbors in this region were all Hutu and Tutsi. And we're not excited to have Batwa people living there. There was a lot of acrimony when we started the project. And so they were dealing with hostile neighbors. But they thought, well, what if one of the things we did was, as we were trying to act in neighborly ways and show them love, what if our first, like I said, first batch of pigs, we all commit to give to some of the neighbors around us. I mean, think about that, 30 families, each giving their first litter of pigs to surrounding neighbors. That's a lot of goodness. That's a lot of creating goodwill and changing the narrative, that we're not a threat to you. We want to be part of adding to the generosity and goodness of our region. We want to be your partners in building a beautiful community here. Another story from that first year is that my husband went up to meet with the committee, and they had this idea: what if we create a road? So we had a prime piece of property right on the main road, and most of their neighbors lived behind them, meaning they would have to take these tiny footpaths to get from the main road where the market was back to their homes. And it made it really hard if they were doing construction because you couldn't bring in even a small pickup truck with supplies. Everything would have to be carried on your back. So our committee came up with the idea, and this was the men and the women together saying, they asked my husband, can we build a road, alongside our property line so that they would have easier access? Now, this would mean giving up 10% of their property. These are people who were unlanded, who had never had land before. But for the sake of neighborliness, they thought maybe if we are willing to give up 10% of our property and build a road to help our neighbors, right, that this would be a gesture of goodness. And their only thing, they said the only catch is that they have to build the road with us. And so for 6 months, Hutu, Tutsi, and Batwa worked together to build that road from the main road back, along the edge of our property line back to where these other families lived. And it was so beautiful because by the end of the 6 months, my husband would go up every other Saturday just to be part of it. And at first, when they would all work together, they were quiet because these Hutu and Tutsi friends, they wanted the road, but they did not want the relationship. So it would be very quiet. But by the end, he said, you go up and they're laughing and they're talking and they're working in mixed groups because over 6 months of Saturdays, they had developed relationship. They had developed neighborliness. And so now, we're 8 or 9 years into that community, and you can't tell, Batwa, Twa, Brun, all the tribes, they work together, they lead together, their kids go to school together. But that really took some big risks on behalf of our Batwa, both men and women.
All right. Well, I have a question for you around if you can imagine some of the New Testament women knowing the story of these Exodus women. What is there any linkage or connection points that you can imagine them knowing these stories of these women for some of the women in the New Testament
Sure.
that would take action? And we see that in different places. And so just wondering if there's any connection points there that you are thinking about.
Sure. Well, I think it's always fun to remember that in the New Testament, when you see a woman named Mary, she most likely is a Miriam. I learned this first in my real life. I have a girlfriend who's Palestinian, and she named her daughter Miriam, but she calls her Mary. And I was like, "Isn't her name Miriam?" And she's like, "Well, Miriam, Mary. I mean, it's like here how we call, Joseph is Joe, or it's Richard is Rick. Well, Mary is always a Miriam. I mean, even today in Palestine, that is the truth. But I also found this to be the case when I was doing my research that Mary was a Miriam. I mean, you could call her Miriam of Nazareth. So she would have been, and so many other Marys in the New Testament were named after Miriam, the Miriam in the Exodus story. The woman who was known to be a community organizer and a singer of liberation songs, and who helped lead that community out of Egypt. And so it isn't a surprise to me to then see Mary, or Miriam of Nazareth, singing the Magnificat. In Exodus, if you can read Miriam's song, her victory song when they are leaving Egypt. And then you read the song, the Magnificat that Mary says in Ein Kerem when she's visiting her cousin Elizabeth. These are liberation songs. These are songs envisioning freedom and turning empires upside down for the sake of justice and goodness for the poor. And I just think you can't not see the ways in which Miriam of old infuses the imaginations of the Miriams in the New Testament.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for that. I think that it kind of encapsulates our time together here. And we are so grateful. Thank you for your great word this morning. Lots of great comments in here about just your storytelling and bringing the story to life in so many tangible ways and so many things that we can learn from that. So we're so grateful for your good work. It's been so fun to have you for these 3 talks, and we would love to do that. So there was a question. Yes, these will be available afterwards. We'll send an email with links to the talks, and folks can kind of share them with their communities. Um, just wanted to highlight one last time, both of Kelley's books are available on with our friends over at Erdman's. So use that promo code UHouse40, and that'll get you 40% off on both of Kelley's books, so which are great. And so you can do that, which is a very generous offer code there for us to have. So, well, good. Well, we are so grateful for your time today. Thanks to you for joining us. Thank you, Kelley, for being on with us this morning. And it was so fun to have you. So
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a delight to be with you these last few days.
awesome. Well, good. Well, we will sign off, and thank you for everyone for joining us here this morning.